It's a real pleasure to be here at Tynecastle this morning, the home of Heart of Midlothian Football Club. I've just had the privilege, the pleasure and the thrill of holding the First Division Championship trophy. And I have to say, as an Ayr United supporter, I couldn't help thinking that was probably the closest I'm ever going to get to that trophy, but we live in hope. It is a pleasure to be here this morning because here at Tynecastle we're standing in a place that is showing all of the positive results of the approach to business that the Business Pledge encapsulates. Anne and her team have done an outstanding job since taking over here at Hearts last year. The club has developed a sound business model, delivered those fantastic results on the pitch, and demonstrated a real and a very deep commitment to the community. As part of all of that, it has paid the living wage, encouraged youth training, and created a healthy gender balance across the workforce. It really is a great example of a company which is now doing well by adopting progressive and sustainable employment practices. And that's obviously very relevant to what I want to talk about this morning. And it is good to see so many of you here today. When I became First Minister last year, I said at the time that I intended to be the most accessible First Minister ever, and it's for other people to judge my success in meeting that objective. But there's no doubt at all that regular dialogue with businesses across the country is an absolutely essential part of that. Hearing your concerns, understanding your priorities and helping to address the challenges that you face. So I'm delighted to see you all this morning, and I look forward to having the opportunity to answer some of your questions later on. Now, of course, the specific reason that we're here today is to launch the Scottish Business Pledge, and I'll speak more about that in a moment or two. But since it's now almost 3 weeks since the general election and just one day before the Queen's speech, I thought I might also take the opportunity to say something about the wider political and economic context. The result of the general election provides both an opportunity and a challenge for the Scottish Government. There's clearly an opportunity, a big opportunity, to ensure that Scotland's priorities are better understood and better reflected on. But of course, there's also a significant challenge for us in working with a majority government at Westminster, many of whose policies we disagree with. That won't always be easy, but it is a challenge, and I want to be very clear about this. It's a challenge we intend to approach in a thoroughly positive and constructive way. At the meeting I had with the Prime Minister David Cameron in Edinburgh just over a week ago was a useful start to that. And I want today to highlight 3 areas in particular where we will seek to achieve outcomes at a UK level which we believe very strongly will benefit the economy here in Scotland. Firstly, we will continue to oppose spending reductions of the scale and speed that the UK government has suggested. We believe that these will slow economic recovery and make deficit reduction more difficult. And that's something that has been demonstrated already by the impact of the cuts that have been imposed since 2010. So we will point out that the Charter for Budget Responsibility actually allows the UK government flexibility to increase spending over its current plans while still reducing the deficit and the debt. And of course, if the UK government does decide to stick to its current proposals, we will argue for ways in which the impact on Scotland can be lessened. Secondly, I don't think it's desirable to hold an in-out referendum on membership of the European Union. But since a referendum is now inevitable, we will work to protect Scotland's interests in that referendum. We'll propose a double majority, meaning that exit from the European Union would only be possible if all 4 nations of the UK agree to that, something that would ensure that Scotland couldn't be forced out of the European Union against our will. And during the run-up to the referendum, the Scottish Government will, of course, make a strong and a positive case for staying within the European Union. We don't think it's perfect. We think reform is both desirable and necessary, but we believe very strongly that Scotland's interests are best served by being members of the European Union, and we will argue that case strongly and positively. And that's something I intend to say more about next week, a week today, in fact, when I make a speech in Brussels. Thirdly and finally, we will seek greater powers for the Scottish Parliament. We want to ensure that the recommendations of the Smith Commission are met in full, but we're also seeking additional responsibilities beyond those that the Smith Commission identified. In particular, we believe that greater power over business taxes, employment law, the minimum wage and welfare would enable us to better create jobs, grow the economy and lift people out of poverty. And as we seek, and hopefully as we gain greater powers here in Scotland, we will work closely with you, the business community, to implement them. We will consult with companies and consider your needs and interests in everything we do. And that recognition of business needs, together with a consultative approach to developing our economic policy, has been a feature of this government's activities so far. When we were first elected back in 2007, one of the first steps we took as a government was to create the most competitive business rates taxation system anywhere in the United Kingdom. In March, we launched our revised economic strategy after close consultation with businesses and with business organisations. And that strategy recognises both the strengths and the weaknesses of our current economic position. Last year, Scotland recorded its strongest economic growth since 2007. Employment growth has also been strong. We've seen especially encouraging figures of late for female and youth employment, although there's absolutely no room for complacency on either of those fronts. But as well as progress, it's true to say that we also face significant challenges, and we must face up to those challenges. Amongst other things, we need to improve productivity, increase exports, diversify our business base, and tackle some of the deep-seated inequalities that exist in Scottish society. And it's maybe worth looking at productivity in a bit more detail. When the Governor of the Bank of England launched the quarterly inflation report 3 weeks ago, he pointed out rightly that productivity growth is the key determinant of income growth. Our shared prosperity depends on it. But the Bank of England's report also highlighted the extent to which the UK as a whole has a productivity problem. Its output per hour worked is still below pre-recession levels. It's 13% below Sweden, 20% below Germany. Scotland's actually fared relatively well in recent years. Back in 2007, our productivity was 6% below the UK's. Now that gap has significantly closed. But that still leaves us placed well below many of our European competitors. And we know that increasing Scotland's total factor productivity by just 0.1% every year could boost GDP by 1.3%. In turn, that could boost employment by 11,000 and tax revenue by £400 million a year after 10 years. So with better productivity, living standards would be higher and the budget deficit would be reduced much faster. And the economic strategy that we launched in March sets out how we intend to achieve that. The strategy is based around what we are calling the 4 I's: innovation, internationalisation, investment in infrastructure and skills, and promoting inclusive growth. All of them will help to boost the productivity of our economy, and all are already significant priorities of the government. For example, we've created 8 innovation centres in the last 2 years, bringing our universities and our businesses together to develop new technologies in areas from construction to stratified medicine. Scotland's international exports have increased by 20% in the last 3 years. That is positive progress. But more than 80% of businesses in Scotland still don't export at all. So there's still much, much more that we can and must do. And in terms of investment, we're spending £11 billion on infrastructure in the 3 years up to this year, including in crucial projects like broadband rollout and the new Queensferry crossing. We've also made it clear that promoting a more equal and inclusive society is an important part of building a stronger and more prosperous economy. And that approach is in line with a growing international consensus supported by the IMF, the OECD, and many others besides. The OECD, for example, found that rising inequality in the UK reduced economic growth by 9% in the years between 1990 and 2010. It published a further report last Thursday which emphasised that very point. And that's why, as a government, we're taking steps to mitigate the consequences of welfare reform. It's why we're promoting greater gender equality, investing in early years education and care, and setting targets to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, has a fair chance to get to university. We know that our economy will do better if everyone in our society has a fair chance to contribute their efforts, their ideas, their talents, and their skills. Essentially, our economic strategy sets out a vision of an economy that is based on innovation rather than insecurity, high skills, not low wages, enhanced productivity instead of reduced job security. We want to climb the global competitiveness rankings on quality rather than racing to the bottom on costs. Of course, we are also acutely aware that none of this can be achieved by government on its own. It requires concerted action across all areas of our economy and indeed our society. And that's why we are determined to build a partnership for productivity with businesses, the third sector, the wider public sector and trade unions. We're fortunate, I think, that in Scotland we already have strong partnerships with business. To give just one example, last week was Modern Apprentices Week. I visited Arnold Clark, I met some of the apprentice engineers there and announced funding to support an additional 500 apprenticeship places. John visited SSE and met some of the apprentices there. In fact, I think virtually every cabinet minister undertook a visit of some kind. And the point I'm making is it was easy for us to do that because there are so many companies in Scotland which employ modern apprentices. The business community across this country has responded superbly to the Make Young People Your Business campaign, and I want to take the opportunity to thank all of you and your colleagues across the country for that. And that's a really good example of the fact that people and businesses are generally keen to do, as Anne described it, the right thing, to provide opportunities for young people, to pay good wages and to help local communities. After all, businesses don't stand apart from wider society. You're part of wider society. But sometimes, and entirely understandably, businesses might need a bit of support, advice or encouragement, or crucially, they might need, and they've a right to expect, some hard evidence about the business benefits of doing the right thing. So that's why the Scottish Government has established 3 initiatives in the last year. Firstly, to support fair work. Secondly, to promote and expand the living wage. And thirdly, the topic of our discussions today, the Scottish Business Pledge. The Fair Work Convention will meet for the second time later this week. It brings together trade unions, the private sector and the wider public sector. It aims to encourage workforce policies which encourage innovation, higher productivity and better workforce engagement. One of its aims is to promote the living wage, and in particular to show that for many individual firms, higher wage costs are covered by increased productivity, lower absenteeism and higher staff retention. The Scottish Government is actually publishing research about these benefits tomorrow, and it's a message which already seems to be meeting a receptive audience here in Scotland. The number of Scottish-based living wage accredited employers has grown from 30 this time last year to more than 200 now. Scotland now has approximately 13% of all accredited living wage employers in the UK, which is significantly more than our population share. I'm confident that the growth we've seen this year in living wage accreditation will continue, and I believe that it will also be reflected in take-up of the Scottish Business Pledge that we're launching today. The principle of the Business Pledge is straightforward. It's emphatically not about putting barriers in the way of business growth. On the contrary, it seeks to enshrine this idea that just as government will work with business and has a duty to work with business to support a prosperous and strong economy, so too will business play a part in helping us deliver a flourishing and fair society. Since we announced the idea of the pledge back in the autumn, we've consulted closely with businesses and business organisations, and your views have helped to shape the pledge, and they will continue to do so. The pledge sets out 9 principles: innovation, internationalisation, prompt payment of suppliers, payment of the living wage, gender equality, opportunities for young people, workforce engagement, community involvement, and standards on 0 hours contracts. It's deliberately very easy to sign up to. There's very little bureaucracy involved. You simply need to state that you pay the living wage, that you already meet at least 2 of the other principles, and that you're committed to achieving the others over time. And as a consequence of the consultation process, the pledge is framed in a way that recognises the real needs and circumstances of businesses. It won't work if this is something that is divorced from and separate from the real-life day-to-day experience of businesses. So in other words, the pledge is ambitious, but it is also intended to be achievable. It encourages companies to take further steps which will benefit their employees, their local communities, and crucially, their own bottom line. I want today to thank the companies that have already committed to the pledge: Aginor, GSK, Heart of Midlothian Football Club, Hymans Robertson, Logic Now, Strata Cleaning, and Virgin Money. I hope that many more of you will take the step of signing up over time. The final point I want to make today is that the business pledge isn't just a commitment from companies. It's a two-way process. It's also a commitment from the Scottish Government and from our enterprise agencies. We know that government can only ask businesses to support the pledge if we, as government, are doing everything we can to support businesses in return. So we will provide advice and assistance for companies that want to meet the terms of the pledge. The pledge website, which goes live today, will help companies to do that. And beyond that, we will continue to do everything we can to help businesses to invest, to innovate, to export, and to expand. We know, and this is perhaps the most crucial point of all, we know that your success underpins the prosperity and the well-being of every community in our country. And therefore, it is important to us that we work as hard as we can to promote and support your success as businesses. So we will work with you to spur productivity and make our economy even more competitive. We'll also help to ensure that the economic growth which results from that brings benefits to individuals and communities across the whole of our country. The Fair Work Convention, the Living Wage Accreditation Scheme and the Scottish Business Pledge are essential features of what is becoming a distinctive Scottish approach to growth. That's why I think today's launch is so significant. And I hope that many, many more companies will sign up to the pledge in the months and years ahead. So let me end by thanking you not just for being here today, but thanking you for all that you do in your businesses in every corner of the country to make this country all that it is. If we work together in the months and years to come, we can make sure that this country's economy becomes more competitive, more prosperous, and that our society becomes fairer. All of us will benefit from all of that. So thank you very much for attending today.